This is $1 million. Tonight, Sherry and Warren Heck, a vocal coach and a restaurant manager from Long Island, New York, will compete with Heidi and Chuck Mahallet, an office manager and a Marine helicopter pilot from Willoughby, Ohio, as they battle for the biggest prize in the history of television. A single word could turn one of these couples into millionaires, all on the $1 million chance of a lifetime. And here's our host, Jim Lange.
Thank you, and welcome to our show. T-S...
Tracy!
You did it! On the dating game, at the beginning of the show, they always, or not always, but occasionally had a performance. But it was timed very, very, very tightly, because you wanted to get the show on. And one Christmas, we booked Agnes Moorehead. She was going to be on the show, asking for a date, and she was reading from St. Luke, the story of Jesus. And it was too long. And so our writer came in and was editing the Bible. And she turned to him and said, "You don't look like St. Luke to me." On the dating game, we kept track of how many marriages there were for quite a few years, and we got up to about 20. And then Chuck Barris was burned badly, and we decided not to count anymore. And that's an interesting story because he was blackmailed. A couple got on the show, went on a date, and had found out somehow that Chuck Barris wanted a marriage for their Valentine's Day show. And so they came in and said, "We're going to get married before Valentine's Day, so we're the couple." So they came on, and with great expense to the network and everybody else, we did a Valentine's show, flying in hearts and music and the whole thing, introducing the couple as a dating game couple who's going to be married. Actually, we introduced them as having been married because their wedding date was prior. Well, after the show was taped, they called up and said, "We aren't married, and we're not going to get married unless you pay us $50,000. So the network was upset. They'd spent a lot of money. Chuck had spent a lot of money. They had to get married, or we had to dump the show. So Mr. Barris went, talked to them, convinced them on a buyout. I don't know how much money he gave them, but he paid them off, personally drove them to Tijuana, got them married till the show was aired, sat with them through Valentine's Day, so that it wasn't a lie, that they really were married. Then he said, "Go your way." And he said, "That's it for marriage. I'm into dating, we'll forget that." Well, the dating game, I guess, was considered hip in its time. Today, it would be almost, things we thought were risque then are seen every day on television. But at the time, it was crossing a line of several things. Lines, first of all, there were no right answers. You never knew what was going to happen. Number two, there were stars on it, and they were participating. So you had that voyeurism at home, you could play along. And it was sort of like a time capsule of clothing. Everybody dressed right for the dating game. I mean, they had to put on whatever was hot in the 60s, 70s, 80s. As you watch these shows on Game Show Network, you'll see a period of time going by with people hairstyle changes, dresses get longer, shorter, and so on. But it was the in thing to do for the stars. Any star in Hollywood who was, I don't know why, I mean, believe me, I don't know why, a Peter Lawford would do it. It was not the money, obviously. It was the exposure. And a lot of the up-and-coming stars, like you mentioned, John Ritter, Bob Saget, there's just to go on and on. Carl Weathers, who was from Rocky, all these people were on the show. When they were not stars, and that check, because they were paid besides the date, they had to get after scale, that kept them in food. I mean, that was one, and it was also exposure. People were just, discovered on the show. There was a fellow who was discovered on the show who played Hercules. And the producer of the show, the Italian director, I can't think of his name now, who did the show, saw him on the dating game and actually got him the job. Pee Wee Herman was discovered on the show. He was on like 7 times, and he was nobody at the time. Andy Kaufman was on. One of the very best dating games was Andy Kaufman. Before he was Latka and all the Taxi and all the things that happened. He was he wanted to be introduced this way, that before the show, we had a dropout, and we had to go out on the street and find this guy. And so we introduced him and kept it very straight, and he sat there, and he played it like Joe Schlub. I mean, he sat there, and he's going, why don't you ask me a question? How come I didn't get a question, Jim? Why didn't do that? And we got letters. People felt so sorry for this guy. He wasn't using the name Andy Kaufman at the time. But it was one of the funniest, especially if you're in on the joke, shows that we ever did. Well, I did a lot of other shows besides The Dating Game, and two of them were Bullseye and Hollywood Connection. They were for Barry and Enright, Jack Barry and Dan Enright, who were the subjects of the movie quiz show, you may know. They were the guys who got nailed for cheating. Dan always told me, he said we weren't cheating. We were putting on a show. I mean, nobody said this had to be real. I mean, they wanted the best possible show, as if it were a dramatic show. Well, after they got burned, they were the most careful people on earth about, protection of questions and so on. And Jack Barry died in the middle of the time when I was working for them, but he was a wonderful guy. And the Juvenile Jury, and remember all the shows he did. And Dan Enright was a brilliant game show producer, and they were just great guys. I'm sorry that they didn't come off a little better in that movie because it didn't capture them correctly. They were wonderful guys. Well, Hollywood Connection was a show where, again, there were no correct answers. These people had to come up with any answers they could, and then the contestant had to decide who said what. And Buddy Hackett was on the show, and Buddy Hackett is one of the scariest guys I've ever seen. Buddy Hackett wants things done his way, and only his way. And there happened to be some smokers on the crew. You didn't smoke. Not on the set. You didn't smoke outside. He would slap it right out of your face. Buddy Hackett's a very opinionated, strong guy, but very funny. He was a great person to have on the show. Tommy Lasorda, the same way. Tommy, the great Dodger, is more than that. He's a funny, good, happy-go-lucky guy, and he was terrific. Zsa Zsa Gabor was on the show, Jan Murray, some of the old standbys, but it was a great, fun show to do. What you can say about most game show hosts, you can say about Bill Cullen. He was a nice guy. He not only was a nice guy, he was brilliant. He had to be brilliant. He had to have control, warmth, because as a lot of people didn't know that Bill had polio, and he had a limp. He was not really an Adonis-looking guy, but he was just so good with people. If you ever see Bill Cullen on a show, Bill is always paying attention, listening, just a charming, wonderful host. Bob Eubanks started game showing when I did back in 1960, a little later because Dating Game started before Newlywed Game, and Bob was out of radio as I was, and Gene Rayburn, a lot of the people came out of radio. And Bob was very bad when he started. He'll tell you. I mean, he was so nervous, but he evolved, and quickly too, into being the perfect past master of waiting. He would let the contestant say something, and then rather than jump in, he would wait and get more. And it was just perfect. He's a wonderful host. Well, Jack Nars is the ultimate professional. Jack and Tom Kennedy, his brother, are just professionals all the way. And again, nice guys, and I might add, very good golfers. Well, Alan Ludden, I think of as the professorial type. Alan would get a show and handle these silly contestants or these silly celebrities he had on the show as the master of control. I mean, Alan was the professor, and again, like everyone that every game show host that I know of probably wouldn't be a success if they weren't nice guys. Well, Wink Martindale, an old friend of mine, and Wink is the epitome of game show hosts. When they do takeoffs on game show hosts, they are doing Wink Martindale, because Wink is that handsome, perfect smile. And he's very good on stage, too, and he there's a lot of things to remember when you're doing a game show. But Wink has the perfect game show look.